Hi, I'm Anderson Brown. I want to talk to you today about Aristotle's aesthetics. Let me get up my title screen here for you. Ready then? Great. Always do that. Here we go. All right. Aristotle's Aristotle's aesthetics in philosophical context. What exactly does that mean? I have here, this is the third video of 4 on Aristotle that I have sort of as a short course, sort of continuity between the first one's on the physics, his theories about change in general and nature and substance. And then the second one, Dionymar, on the soul, his psychology, his theory of mind. Then this one on the poetics and his aesthetics, and then the last video on the Nicomachean ethics. So the idea here is we're going to get right to it right now. Get a little bit of first of all his theory of nature in the physics, how that relates to his theory of the mind and the self that we see in his text Dionysma, and how that informs what he tells us about aesthetics and aesthetic experience in the poetics. So the idea here is to go for a kind of systematic understanding of Aristotle, where we can see some of the connections between some of the major works. And so that's the idea. So quickly then, because I don't want to talk about the metaphysics or the psychology for a very long time. But so first of all, the metaphysical context. In the physics, Aristotle says primary being is substance. Substance, which is actually a complex of form and matter. So Aristotle's unusual in that a lot of people would have the intuition that primary being would be kind of simple, some kind of simple thing. Aristotle says that it's substance because Aristotle sort of starts with the world as it is, so that the world is a complex place made out of parts in the first place is something that's characteristic of Aristotle's thought. So you have form always found in matter and matter always found in form, because Aristotle's trying to steer the sort of middle way between the dualism of Plato, a real metaphysical dualism between the form and matter, form existing independently of matter and their interaction being mysterious on the Platonic view, and Aristotle trying to get around that with his idea that you really only find form in matter, you only really find matter in form. And the human organism then is one of these substances. You know, substances aren't everything. Aristotle says he's talking about primary matter, but he's not talking about all the matter. He takes organisms to be sort of a primary, the sort of basic example of what he really means by a substance. He also thinks that human artifacts are substances because they fit all the criteria. We'll talk about that. So second bullet point, what characterizes an organism then is the teleological, I'm sure everyone's heard this word, teleological, about Aristotle, design of each of the parts. So take the heart, for example. You can describe the organ physically all you want. Physical description, you can say it's red, it has 4 chambers, it weighs 8 pounds, it's made out of muscle, what you will. But you don't answer the question, what is this thing, the what is it question, until you give the functional description, not the physical description. The functional description is it's a pump. It's a pump to pump the blood. And the functional description then explains the function that part, the part of the whole, the organ of the organism, plays in the larger system, in the whole organism. And so we talk about teleology, meaning that according to Aristotle, then you only can explain the part, for example, paradigmatically an organ of an organism, in terms of the whole organism and not the other way around. Of course, that's mereology, the study of the relationship between the whole and the parts. Aristotle's a real genius at that. So everything then has a function, every part has a function, and then on a more cosmic level, Aristotle at least strongly implies that every individual thing in the cosmos also has a function in the in the totalizing organism that is the cosmos. I think that's about as close to some kind of theology as Aristotle gets at the end of the physics. All right, so there's this goal of fulfillment that lies in the future. Again, this is from the physics. This is the way Aristotle characterizes all of substances, all organisms. So last bullet point on the slide, this account of change as the becoming and passing of substance is more of an event ontology than an object ontology. I don't want to be anything real technical there. The cosmos is an event, the universe is an event. It's not a thing. And individual objects are events. They come to be and pass away. Well, Plato thinks this is too, because matter forms into intelligible members of formal categories and then passes out. Aristotle offers a description of the organism as a process and of the organs as functions in the process. And that is going to be very important when we get to considering the Poetics and its aesthetics. I think you can already see a little bit how that's going to inform that. More specifically, Aristotle's psychology, the logos of the psyche. Aristotle takes psyche to be anything that's causing self-caused movement of the organism, including reproduction, growth, plants turning towards the sun, that sort of thing. Plato is not like a modern Cartesian. He does not think that the mind belongs to a separate ontological category from the body. He doesn't buy that. Plato is not, well, in any event, Aristotle doesn't buy that. And that's an important thing about, in fact, that's one of the most interesting things about De Anima. So Aristotle's psychological work, then the second video in the series is De Anima, or On the Soul, dell'Anima, in which he gives us a naturalistic account of mind that's, I think, strikingly modern, reminds me of some 20th century accounts. Second bullet point, thoughts and feelings on his view are forward-aiming, essentially biological processes like perception or locomotion, he would say, unintelligible outside of the context of a living being in a particular environment. Aristotle does, by the way, think this is true both about cognition and about feeling, about both intentional states that have content and about affective responses. He thinks both of them need to be understood like everything in some kind of functional context, in some kind of holistic context that points to the role that they're playing in some larger system, because they are organismic traits to him. And remember, not a mind-body dualist, not making a distinction between a physical trait, a behavioral trait, a mental trait. And he doesn't see that. Psyche, and he's identified with the life cycle and with life itself. And I say in parenthesis at the end of that second bullet point, this is the essential disconnect in any form of mind-body dualism. Anytime you've got, like, for an immortal soul, an immaterial soul, an unextended soul, you've got that psychology, that essential understanding. For example, if you think there must be some mental content there, what are the beliefs, what are the desires and other intentional states? And if you've got that disconnected with the life cycle of the organism, which you take to be irrelevant, then that's a really bad disconnect. Aristotle doesn't have that. Last bullet point, Aristotle's concept of happiness, closer to Stoic and Epicurean ideas of satisfaction, ataraxia. He is 4th century. He's at the dawn of the Hellenic. Remember, he's Hellenic period. He's Alexander's tutor. Alexander is going to come riding out of Macedonia sometime around 10 years after Aristotle writes the Poetics, around the middle of the 4th century BCE. Aristotle's concept of happiness, closer to, say, Epicurean and Stoic ideas, that is satisfaction, than to hedonistic, contingent, pleasure-based concepts. So we're talking about happiness in general. Like Plato, Aristotle sees satisfaction as coming through the realization of virtue, understood as best potential for a being of that kind. And so this theory of value, of course, has everything to do with his aesthetics. He's going to tell us what he thinks is good and bad about aesthetics and what's going on, how drama works. The genre of art that Aristotle mainly discusses in the Poetics is drama. By the way, it's an interesting thing, you know. Sophocles premiered Oedipus Rex sometime around the beginning of that 6th century, 430. And Aristotle is writing the Poetics just about 100 years later after that. Aristotle's a big Sophocles fanboy. He obviously knows all kinds of stuff about the Oedipus cycle. He's very interested in it. So I think that's significant. And Aristotle is a scholar. He's talking about these plays literally best part of a century since the heyday of the great dramatic competitions in Periclean Athens in the 5th century. Second bullet point, Aristotle identifies the function of drama in the development of a human being. What's the function? What's it for? It's to help members of the audience develop. He presents the elements, that sounds like homework, but I'm going to talk about that. He presents the elements that any dramatic work must contain to achieve its virtue developing function. This is what they have, this is what it has to do in order to work. Crucially, this is the last sentence in the second bullet point. Crucially, this is an explanation of why we enjoy drama. So I think sometimes both Plato and Aristotle can seem very meretricious, and they're sort of telling us this is our duty. It's all deontological. But in Aristotle, especially, that's definitely not the case. I mean, he's saying, look, there is pleasure. We feel the pleasure. What is it? Where does the pleasure come from? He's got a theory of pleasure. He says the reason that we like it is because it stimulates this development of our potentials and our realizing potentiality, just as what sort of human life is. So, for example, last bullet point, when Aristotle categorizes tragedy as high and comedy as low, he means tragedy explores the reversals of fortune, the noblest types, or the noblest parts of one's own nature, and comedy, the reversals suffered by us and others because of our baser natures. But the developmental dialectic of reversal and revision is the same. I mean, that's a lot. The developmental dialectic, okay, a dialectic where there's positive and negative reinforcement for one thing, but then you get the reversal, and the reversal of fortune causes you to realize things both cognitively and emotionally, and you now have realized your virtues to a greater extent, and you are more competent to deal with adversity and complexity for that. The Manual of Playwrights, Aristotle's Manual for Playwrights, quickly. 6 essential dramatic elements: plot, character, diction, spectacle, song, and thought. Aristotle says plot's the most important creation of the playwright. That's what the genius, remember, he loves Sophocles. The sequence of events that puts the character into a situation, and thus through an experience of thinking and feeling. Certainly is true with Hollywood movies, I must say. I mean, I'll give anything for a good story sometimes, you know. And so it has to be something unfamiliar and challenging to the audience, difficult to come up with for jaded audiences then and now. And Aristotle, third bullet point, explains even the basest and most odious characters have to be relatable as human beings, he says. Not always observed by all scriptwriters and playwrights, I might add. But he says, look, it's not going to do any good if you don't see that every person in the screen is a person having these experiences of reversal, because you've got to see that they're having what kind of reactions and growth. If not, universal lessons would not be generated by the performance. Now, Aristotle has a lot to say about rhetoric. The last bullet point there, it's just sound technical advice of the sort that we really expect from Aristotle. Aristotle is not a head in the clouds philosopher. Aristotle is a sort of researcher and observer. You've got your script, you've got the visual, you've got the audio. You need to have the right balance. It needs to be coherent. All needs to make sense, hang together. You can't see the machinery. Exactly the kinds of things that you would somebody would say in film school. He just points that out. All right, catharsis. Probably, if anybody talks about Aristotle's aesthetics or the Poetics, the first thing that they talk about is catharsis. And catharsis is one of these words now that's entered into our pop vocabulary as a kind of cliche word. And as with many of these words that come from ancient sources, it's not really, it doesn't originally mean what it's used for now. Doesn't mean that, it's used in some dumb way now or anything like that. And we're just here for understanding. I'm not in a critical mode. Catharsis is the best known word concept identified with the Poetics, but the popular understanding of the word isn't exactly what Aristotle means. It's okay, but let's go over what that means. Second bullet point. The popular understanding of catharsis maintains it is like this. You go, and we all go and we watch the couple falling in love and then breaking up, or watch Arnold Schwarzenegger dangling out of a helicopter in a machine gun fight, or whatever it is that we watch. And it's something that we in our ordinary humdrum lives don't ordinarily experience. So it makes us feel good to experience it. And the teenagers are loving the slasher movie because of the buildup of tension, the release of tension just feels good. I say there in that second bullet point, this is similar in its implicit hedonism to pop culture usage of, for example, nirvana would be another one of these pop culture words that's been appropriated. It doesn't really mean a sort of ecstatic state like when you took drugs or something, but people will talk about it that way. And catharsis is if it feels really good, like I don't know, like burping or something. You know, it's this kind of it's a release, right? An eruption of feeling. That's not really, but we already saw, you know, Aristotle thinks that the form is flowing through the matter, falling, moving into the potentialities like water flows into empty spaces. And we saw that the human psychological experience is an experience of the vicissitudes of this flow as you as a process, as you as a being that's becoming encounter the various obstacles and contingencies in your path. Uh, Meanwhile, according to Aristotle, all positive experiences of human beings reflect the satisfaction we get from realizing our potential. Yeah, he's not saying we should feel that way, or if we were dutiful, or if we were good Boy Scouts, that's what we would think. You know, he's saying this is theory of value. This is why people like things and don't like other things. And this is really what's going on. You find if you dig it, if you analyze it, or whatever word you want to use, you'll find that that's what's going on. For Plato, this means maximizing our rationality. Plato's a sort of transcendental mystic person who says, like the Abrahamic Christian, right, or Muslim, rise up above, you know, the sufferings of the flesh and in Plato's into Plato's pure rationality. Aristotle doesn't like that. He doesn't like dualism. He's not a mystic. He likes natural science. I think he'd be in a biology department if he were at a university today. And he has a much more holistic approach. Last sentence on the slide. Catharsis for Aristotle is growth of character through exercise, through the exercise of our responses. Related to another word he likes, praxis, which is a favorite Aristotelian word taken up by Marxist theorists later, the unity of theory and practice. We go to the drama or any art, and what we're doing is getting ourselves, is training ourselves. We're having experiences, which brings me to this question, which I think is interesting. I was teasing it out. Aristotle's not a mind-body dualist, and he has a change-oriented physics. You know, the mind-body dualist, someone who thinks that the soul is immortal or the soul exists independently of the body or the soul is a unity with everything or whatever, you know, has a certain very pretty fixed notion of the self, just conceptually. Aristotle sees the self as an event, and he doesn't have a distinction between the mind and the body at all. So there's a fascinating erasure of real selves and fictional selves. I find it this time reading the Poetics kind of charming was the adjective that came to my mind, the way he's talking about the way we're building ourselves up. And it's like Cervantes and Shakespeare. And Cervantes and Shakespeare writing there at the beginning of the Baroque period, you know, a huge pivotal transitional point, and they very clearly see the difference between this mythological sort of picture that we have of ourselves at that point, at the beginning of the 1600s, 17th century, and the reality of what's happening there. And Cervantes, you know, the old and the new. So, second bullet point. Our lives, according to this Aristotelian version of this teaching, are a dynamic process aimed at flourishing, which is realizing the virtues of a member of our kind. As we experience new and different situations, we're developing our minds, quote unquote, right, which are not fully formed entities, but these are functional abilities of the organism. And as the immune system produces antibodies, what do I mean by that? You know, you get the toxin, the pathogen comes into the body, and the immune system checks it out and comes up with innately the right response to that. And these cognitive and affective responses that we have to simulating ourselves through drama into these challenging situations are doing that kind of thing with our potentials. They're pulling our potentials up. Last bullet point on the slide. There's no self other than the living organism. Aristotle's real big on the thing that's the form and the thing that's got the right shape, but the thing that's the real deal. No mind other than the unfolding life itself. there's not a set, stable mind. There's an open-ended dialectical building up of definition of the self. That's life. The self unfolds, its telos conditioned by the contingencies of life. And I say in that parenthesis at the end of the slide, as in Plato, nature and nurture both closely attended. They, as social theorists, these ancient Greeks are organic social theorists. They see the human community as a part of nature, and so they don't see the debate as pivoted. The theoretical debate is pivoting on nativist versus learning models at all the way early modern people did. So compared with Plato then, because we were talking about aesthetics and art, what they make of art, I have a video on Republic Book 3, probably is the best one to look here. What is commonly understood about Plato is he takes, what most people would tell you is he takes the influence of art, culture, and social conventions with the utmost seriousness. He certainly does. And he is a communistic thinker, so he's very authoritarian about that, to the point that he advocates a strict, exclusive aesthetic regime that rejects notoriously what everyone knows, mimetic, that it's imitative or representational work, in favor of authenticity. We don't look at the way that Plato and his character Socrates talk about authenticity as much as we should. A man ought not bark like a dog. You need to be, in fact, they sort of have an authenticity fetish. This Stoic man, Socrates. However, second bullet point, I think this is important, a further misunderstanding due to an equivocation between representation and art, right? Because we know Plato doesn't like representation, so he's anti-art. Plato hates art, but that's not true at all. In fact, Plato thinks Plato's just like a modern person with the politicization of everything, that there's nothing sort of isn't political, and Plato takes that certainly at the level of taste, or what we would call art or aesthetic, experience. He thinks that you really shouldn't have any boundary there, and everything that we make and do should be as artful as possible. He's really, really into that. So, so I think I'm not a big Plato apologist here, but I think it's important to get that. Last bullet point, though, as to Aristotle, compared with Plato, Aristotle rejects this Platonic dualism, of course. The big problem with Plato's aesthetics is Plato's disdain of physical beauty and physical pleasure. And if you want, you can look at 20th century art as sort of a rejecting or a rebalancing out from this over-valorizing of the rational element in classical Platonic art. But again, that's not Aristotle. Aristotle, if you take sort of the three parts of soul as Plato talks about them, say in Book 4 of the Republic, reason, discipline, and passion, and typically you sort of see this argument between reason and passion, but Aristotle says, addresses the very topic and says he's really mostly interested in discipline, that interactive element. He thinks that's the element, because he thinks that what this sort of mid-millennial teaching is all about is sort of self-control, the civilizing of the self through self-control. So he shares with Socrates these Stoic values of self-control. Okay. Plato's Socrates acknowledges the rational necessity to maintain the body, and Plato sees the human self as in the process of becoming. So pragmatically, they're not so far apart. Only Plato valorizes this rational element, as they say, to the 20th century, and modern art is a response to that. To the neglect, Aristotle would say, of the rest of the organism. Aristotle is more holistic and natural. Aristotle, when you look at him again this way systematically, and you look at his views in the physics and the way it informs what he talks about with these applied topics, is he's really very, he's not what you expect. He's certainly sort of the anti-Plato in some ways. Last slide, and then we're done. Is art for pleasure or for self-improvement? Something that people are wary of. Students will be put off by the ancient Greeks, both Plato and Aristotle. They're too strict. They're authoritarians. They're fascists. They don't, everything's duty. But remember, Aristotle's virtue theory is a kind of value theory. He says we like things because those things are helping us realize our potential. And when we encounter stuff and experiences and qualities and things that we don't like, that's because the reverse is true. And this is a theory. It's not an injunction. He's not telling us what he thinks we should do. He's trying to figure out. He's just trying to get understanding. oftentimes we mistake things. We think philosophers are trying to solve problems. Good philosophers like Aristotle aim for understanding. So last bullet point, self-realization maybe isn't exactly what's meant by self-improvement, but pleasure on Aristotle's account is neither detached nor hedonistic. That's a little loose. As in Plato, there's no genuine pleasure that is unhealthy. I guess that's the point. So anyway, then just to end here, the thing to sum up there then is that Aristotle has an idea that things come to be and pass away. Everything has a sort of larger function in the world and its environment at a minimum, and the parts are functional. So things are kind of trying to realize their function, and human mental experience, human qualitative experience, human thinking, all of that is part of this unfolding that we are undergoing as organisms living our life cycle. So then there isn't much of a distinction. I was talking about that on the one slide between drama and real life for Aristotle. We're sort of having a collective kind of simulation of some situations and we're enjoying it and getting something out of it because we're relating to it as human beings, and that means that our little parts of our realization, our emotion, our EQ, our emotional responses, as well as our sort of wisdom, understanding how things go with people, are just getting that much better. In a way, there's nothing sort of real mysterious about that. But I think that's Aristotle's basic approach to aesthetics. I don't think, as I said, I don't think it's a duty-based kind of thing. I think it's a very biological approach. And maybe it's, as the last thing I'll say, that it's true that if you're not a mind-body dualist, if you're just a thoroughgoing monist, naturalistic person about the mind and psychology, like Aristotle, then it might be that you can't be a hedonist. If hedonist is some kind of pleasure experience, sort of in a I don't know, a functionless way. But I'm not sure. That's an interesting question. Anyway, Aristotle's aesthetics. And then to finish up, we'll have a fourth video on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, sort of his, I think, where he finally gets in terms of giving advice once he's talked about nature, about psychology, and now about aesthetics and values. Okay, so thanks for listening. Bye-bye.